Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm with Brendan Hilder. Brendan is someone who's worked with us a couple of times now with two different clients, both supporting some large-scale enterprise-wide transformation type work. Brendan's a career business analyst, senior business analyst. Whatever title it is, Brendan's the one who comes in and basically leads the analysis that then supports the transformation. Works really well with the business, and of course in that role you need good, strong communication skills, and we're going to demonstrate some of that today as we're talking. So why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself, Brendan?
Yeah, sure. I'm a business analyst, a career business analyst, as you say. I've got about around 30 years in it, so a long time. Originally from Australia, as you can probably hear. I came to the UK 25 years ago for 6 weeks and ended up staying, so that's all good. Career and business analyst, I think one of the things I liked about the UK was the diversity and the diverse businesses that I've worked for. So
I think what you demonstrate is like what a lot of our interim managers demonstrate, and that is that you are truly industry agnostic.
absolutely, yeah. And sometimes that can be, most of the time, that's an advantage because you don't go in with a preset mindset. Occasionally, you could do with a little bit more detail on how something works, but I would say 90% of the time it's an advantage.
Yeah, I think so too. I think what people who've got industry agnostic experience bring is industry best practice from lots of different industries, and just a new way of looking at that particular business. And what we mentioned before about the communication skills, that ability to communicate with the business and extract out all the jewels within that business, but then apply best practice. That for me is business analyst gold. Right,
Absolutely.
why don't we tell people a bit about what we're going to be talking about today? Because we've had a pre-discussion about this, and what we decided to do was talk about the as-is process mapping. So understanding what you want to change, and the reason why I wanted to speak about this in particular is because I read quite an interesting comment quite recently that says something along the lines of businesses should have their as-is processes mapped at all times, updated at all times, because when you start moving into transformation, that's really when it's going to add benefit. Now, I agree with that in principle if you can do it, but I think in the current economic climate where some businesses are looking like they might have to do transformation, so force change, being ready makes you look like a great exec leader.
Absolutely. And with in an ideal world, you would have all your processes mapped. Most of the time, people don't, and that's where I pop in. But the advantage that gives you is you know where you are before you try to get to where you want to be, and your costs actually, that cost of transformation or the cost of any change is lessened because rather than having to go away and analyze how the business works and understand it, you can use those process maps as a basis of your initial analysis. And then you can ask questions, you can necessarily see pain points. And mapping them isn't an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and that is understanding where the business is today, understanding the nuances of the business. And those processes can be used right along the analysis and then into your testing, into your change, etc. So it really gives you a good basis to start.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think it also accelerates the pace of change, which is great. A lot of companies, they need that if they're going into forced change. But I also think from a cultural perspective, I think it should be part of a business's culture to understand its processes and therefore understand what it's really doing. If you sit back and take the helicopter view, or you bring in, someone once told me this, and I use this quite a bit, that, if you bring in a very smart new graduate into the business, can they understand it from looking at your business processes? And I think that's a really good benchmark.
Absolutely. And you should be able to, when a new starter happens, you should be able to give them those process maps, your conceptual process maps. They're not necessarily how it works, but this is how it, this is more what we want.
Yeah.
And they should understand the business. And depending on the person coming in, that can be abstracted to a director level or down to a graduate level. So the graduate would want to know more detail. Your programmer would want to know more detail.
Yeah.
Director would maybe want on one page.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And when it comes to understanding what the business needs to change or wants to change, how does really well documented process, how do they support that?
It supports it because you can use that as a discussion point, right? We want to change this area of the business or this area of process. How does it work today? And rather than sitting around and having a discussion and investigating, which can, depending on the people there, can take a small amount of time, can take days, depending on how complex it is. But if you've got a basis to say, this is how it works today, this is my pain points, this is who's responsible, this is the steps, etc., etc. You can understand so much about the business.
Yeah, very true. I think also, maybe it's almost starting with intention because, you imagine the scenario and just from a human level that, you're in the meeting and you're saying, right, okay, well, I think, we maybe need to look at our processes. Maybe we've slipped into bad process, or maybe, we're off the playbook, or maybe things just need updating or something like that. That discussion is along the lines of, I think maybe, or maybe we should, or it's a bit ambiguous. Whereas
Yeah,
if you've got your processes already detailed and you've got your process detailed, the conversation becomes, okay, we think that's the case. Let's look at our as is processes and then let's decide if we do want to make a change. That's a much more positive conversation, isn't it?
it is. And sometimes changes I've identified haven't necessarily been in the process. If
Yeah.
they had been documented, the business could have identified them. I always think back to one where the industry, I was out with the engineer and I said, "What are you doing there?" And he said, "Well, I'm making a call to get something changed." I said, "How long does that take?" He said, "Oh, probably a 10, 15-minute phone call, but 30 seconds on the phone." That wasn't documented anywhere. We then documented that and recognised it and modified their system, which took 50,000 call minutes out of their call centre a month.
Oh
That
my
was a
goodness.
massive gain that no one had recognised, not because it was not documented, I suppose. It was just not thought through. I'm not sure, but it definitely wasn't documented. It was only found by pure accident.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of my engineering services, FM type clients, and they're thinking of that number and going, wow, that's going to make a difference to the bottom line. Margins are thin, and you look to make savings where you can, and that's an easy one to identify, isn't it?
Yeah, it was an interesting one because it wasn't sexy, so no one really picked it up, if that's the right term. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was changing for the business, for the company.
And tell me about putting together the as is processes. You're going in there as a business analyst. You're more qualified to talk about this than what I am. But you go into a business, and do people immediately just not want you there because they fear that you're the precursor to some change that they don't want, or do people tend to be quite friendly with you? Like, how disruptive is it? How does it work when you walk into a business?
It depends on the business. Some businesses have more want the change. Other businesses push back a little bit, but that's part of being a business analyst, of talking to them and understanding, helping them to understand you're there to help them and talking to them and not imposing change on them, because most of the time the business knows what the change is. Occasionally they'll miss something because they just don't understand that that's possible, like the
Yeah.
call minutes. But most of the time, talking to the business, they know exactly where their pain points are. They sometimes rush to a solution, so we have to step back and say, let's document what it is. Let's document the volumetrics of it and understand, because if you've got 10 pain points and one only happens once a month, but the other happens hundreds of times a day, you would concentrate on the 100 times a day one, and helping the business see that. As I say, most businesses, the vast majority of businesses are there and actually champing at the bit to have you help them.
Yeah, and that's definitely the feedback that we've received when we're going and delivering change or supporting the delivery of change with clients. The vast majority of their employee base want us there because they want the changes. I think the same thing always applies, and most people want to come in and do a good day's work. And if they can improve something, they want to be part of that often.
Yeah, and you don't impose change on them. You help them to recognise what the change could be and take them along with you on the journey.
And from a process mapping perspective, like, is the documentation complicated? Like, is it easy for someone like me, let's say, to understand it?
The less complicated you can make it, the better. As I said earlier, you have to recognise who your audience is, and that's why you always start at an abstracted, a higher level, and then go down into the lower levels. And depending who you're talking to, they will give you a high level. Some will give you the business rules, which is great to go in your processes. Some will give you ask them for the pain points, you collect the volumes and that type of stuff. It's not a page turner by any stretch of the imagination, but it should be something they're comfortable to read and say, oh yeah, I get this. And it even comes down to how you document your processes, because a process map, the definition of a process is done by one person in one place at one time. So a process map they say the eye can sort of hold 7 to 10 squares, if you like. If you've got more than 7 to 10 squares in your process map, you should probably break it out. It's not one process. And so that's where you make it easier to read. You always start, I see so many process maps where the intent is there, but they haven't necessarily had the training on how to write a process map. So you always start with an active verb. Each process step should have an active verb, manage something, visualize something, or whatever it be. And a process step isn't an outcome. And when you take that and change that for them, they get it. They go, oh, gotcha, okay. And that helps them along the way. I tend to use, there's lots of different methods. I think the standard one is business process modeling notation. I tend to use that. Every business uses it a little bit different, but no one is right or wrong. It's just they use it a little bit different. Some things are more wrong than others, I suppose, but
Yeah. We've seen all sorts of outputs from clients. Strangely, or probably not so strangely, but a lot of the time, if the client's trying to do the business mapping or the process mapping, the as-is mapping themselves using internal people, in theory, they think that's a good idea because it'll be quicker because these guys understand it. But what we found in practicality is that once they submit them through and we have someone independent just to go through and spot check some of the processes, there's a lot of assumption in there. Yep. And when there's assumption in there and you can't ask the stupid question, that's when you get some gaps in the processes, like you mentioned earlier about the engineer that's on the phone for 20 minutes and just killing time.
And don't get me wrong, that stuff that the business does is helpful, and you don't start with a fresh piece of paper. That stuff you use to drive, okay, it's sort of almost, there's a concept of form over content. So the content is probably right, but the form's just not quite right. So let's get a standardized approach in for them and help them, because those processes, the conceptual processes, depending on whether we're just making changes to, like, you've got people, process, and technology, we may be just making change to the people in the process. They can go into the procedures, and exactly the same for that stuff can then, if we're going into technology, we can use that stuff again to work out to what business rules, for instance, do we have to put into the technology?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's a lot of movement towards AI and some element of automation and so forth. And I know there's a lot of buzzwords around that, and there's so many articles all over the internet about it. But from a practicality perspective, it's coming, and therefore some businesses at the moment are looking at mapping their as-is processes because they want to be ready to start making decisions on a small amount of automation and a small amount of AI technology. And I think you need to understand your processes before you can do that.
You do, absolutely. And from what I'm seeing, AI isn't a panacea, but it's definitely going to help us, and with requirements gathering, which we'll discuss another time, it's definitely helped me shorten the requirements gathering process.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the question that we were asking, or that we want to discuss today, is, as is process mapping, understanding what you want to change. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Yes, sometimes we need to be risk averse with understanding what we want to change. Sometimes we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah,
and if you're saying, actually, this process, we're not going to do it any way near how we do it today, we wouldn't go into the detail, too much detail, as the as-is processes. We want to understand them and say, actually, that doesn't work for us. Could we change it? That tends to be more, do we need to, that step in there. One business I worked for, we redid their processes, and I would say to them, I'd say, why do you do that step? They'd say, it's a regulation. And a lot of the time I'd say, okay, can you give me the regulation? They'd go away and the regulation was there, fine. But a lot of the time they'd go away and say, actually, there's no regulation. There was a very good reason for doing it when they did it.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily to do it now. And we may make that change. And that's where not having too much detail of the actual business, because that can set your blinkers on, if you like. I know they do it this way, so I'll help them do it that way. But that's an advantage sometimes of not knowing too much how the business works.
Yeah, like we said before, you feel like you've got the license to ask the stupid question, which a lot of people are internal just might not want to do that.
No,
okay. And I mean, the couple of areas that you worked with us, or a couple of businesses that you worked with us, is engineering services.
Mm-hmm.
And within engineering services, this is with field-based engineers. I know full well that on both of those occasions that you've been out with the guys who are in the vans, guys and girls that are in the vans doing the actual job. Is it essential for someone who's mapping as-is processes to get into that much detail and understand who's delivering these processes?
I think for me it is. Other people may have a different opinion, but all my golden nuggets that I've found over the years, and there are some real golden nuggets out there, I've found when I'm out with the engineer asking, why do you do it that way? And that's where if they're even if their processes were mapped to the nth degree, I would want to do a couple of trips with them just to understand what exactly is it that, and this is where I found the golden nugget. Another one, the process said it worked this way, and logically it sounded really good. I went out and saw one of the people on site. He goes, yeah, that's how it in theory works, but in process, every bit of the technology is broken. So it never worked that way. He said, we don't use that. And what we were able to do by capturing it then was change it back then, rather than it was a full technology refresh, rather than when the technology refresh happened, it would have been broken. And we would have looked.
Good point.
Yeah. So.
Well, I'm a massive believer in that. If you're delivering a transformation, let's say it's at a field-based engineering services business, that every single person that works on that transformation program will have gone out with an engineer in a van at some point. And I know it's very old school to think that way, but I don't think that you can have experts like that in the field and not listen to them.
And exactly. And one of the concepts of business analysis is apprenticing. So that's exactly what you're doing. You're apprenticing, whether it be going out in the van or whether it be sitting on the phones with someone and just seeing how their phone calls do. All of those things, that's where I have my, that's how it works moments.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I like that. And I think that's why we work well together with a couple of clients, and the feedback from the clients has been great, is because you do get involved, and I think that's really important. Going back to the question, I think we've answered the question. I think hopefully we've given some people that are listening some really good insight into how business analysts think and why we need to map out the as-is processes, either ongoing or certainly before some kind of transformation. And I know that a lot of people have got their own view of business analysis. It's been around a long time and everyone understands it to some extent. But what you've explained is the holistic view, and the reason why having a hands-on approach is really important. So thank you for your time, Brendan. I think you've had a lot of value in that 20 minutes.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.